If you have any questions or comments about the case, you can email us at nextofkinpodcast@gmail.com. You can also leave us a voicemail for us to play on the show by going to speakpipe.com/nextofkin. If we have enough responses, we'll sit down with Catherine and record a bonus episode discussing your questions and comments.
According to criminal law, to convict a person of a crime and to find them guilty, one must prove the guilt with evidence.
Everything discussed to this point regarding Jim's acquaintance and his family member would be considered circumstantial at best. Jim's acquaintance had a long rap sheet and even had a complicated past with Jim, sure, but that alone does not make one guilty of murder.
What about the possibility of Jim's murder being random?
There are two essential questions about how Jim was murdered that need answered. Was Jim murdered by just one person or more? And was it personal? Or could it have been random? First, let's recap the timeline of the weekend so far, with a few small details that we need to add in along the way.
Saturday, Catherine goes Christmas shopping with Jim. That night is Light Up Shelbyville. Jim eventually makes his way back to his house on Rockbridge Road, as he decided not to attend the local festivities.
The last person to speak to Jim was his girlfriend, who again we're calling Anita. Phone records show, and Jim's girlfriend confirms, that the couple was up late that night talking on the phone.
Yeah, we talked several times. Him and Catherine had been out shopping that Saturday. Then he called me that night, and we always talked for an hour or more on the phone at night to say goodnight. It was after 12, between 12:15, 12:30 maybe. And I mean, he was going to bed, he was like, I better get off here. I got to go, we got to get up in the morning if we're going riding tomorrow, And I was like, okay, sounds good. I said, just call me right after church. And, cause we went to church at different times. And I usually went on Saturday night at Southeast, and then he went on Sunday morning. So, I don't know. I keep thinking after we got off the phone, were they just watching him? Like, a lot of times he went and pulled his blind. Were they sitting outside watching across the street at the church? Or, a lot of times he didn't close his blind till late. He'd say, oh, I got to get up and close these blinds. He's like, well, there's not like anybody watching me across the street. There ain't nobody there at the church, and he'd laugh. And so, several times it's gone through my mind thinking, were they waiting for him? Was he sitting there in the living room on the phone and they waited till he hung up? And then did they go over and knock, or did they just go over and open the door and go in? Because, as far as I know, he never had any guns in the house. I remember one time I said, you don't own a gun? He was like, no, I don't own a gun.
Jim's murder takes place after this phone call, the early hours of Sunday morning, November 9th. We know this because at around 3 a.m., someone is seen on blurry bank ATM footage driving Jim's truck and withdrawing money from Jim's bank. It's safe to assume that Jim is already dead when this footage is captured.
Something else to add to the timeline, after Jim gets home from Christmas shopping with Catherine, Jim's friends, Kathy and Toot, stopped by to see if Jim wanted to go out with them, but Jim already planned on staying in for the night and declined. That makes Kathy and Toot the last people to physically see Jim alive.
Also, Catherine and Tony weren't the only people to stop by Jim's house on Sunday. Actually, 4 people stopped by Jim's house, even before Catherine and Tony did. Jim's friends Kathy and Toot and their son drove by Jim's house earlier in the day on Sunday and noticed that his water hose was out and at the end of his driveway, and the water was still running. Thinking nothing of it, Kathy rolled it back up for him and went on about her day.
If you're wondering why she didn't knock on Jim's door and tell him about the hose, we have to remember that Jim's truck wasn't in the driveway because the suspects took it and dumped it downtown. So she must have assumed he forgot about the hose and just wasn't home.
Another weird detail about this visit is that Kathy's son was with her, and he supposedly offered to climb through Bo's dog door and check inside. A bit of a strange suggestion considering Jim's truck wasn't even in the driveway. Here's Charles Binion, who we heard from briefly in episode 1. Here he's talking about this specific visit with Kathy, her son Kyle, and Toot.
Kyle was with them at some point because I think Kyle offered to go through the dog door to unlock the door, and I think Toot and Kathy said, no, we're not going to go in there if he's not here. Toot told me that. I remember Toot saying, Kyle offered to go in there because Kyle could fit in that door. And he could have gone in there and unlocked it. And he said, I'm just glad that he didn't. We didn't unlock it. We didn't discover Jim. So I think Kyle was with them the day they went over there and wrapped up the garden hose.
The last person to stop by Jim's house on Sunday, before Catherine and Tony, was actually Jim's girlfriend, Anita. Here she is talking about their plans on Sunday and her trip over to Jim's house when she couldn't get in contact with him that afternoon.
I had talked to him that night, and everything was great. We were going to meet after church the next day and go horseback riding. And then he never called, and I waited all day. I kept calling, and I called Catherine, and I said, Catherine, something's wrong. Like, he has never returned a call. We were supposed to meet after church. We were going horseback riding. I said, I even drove out to the house. His truck wasn't in the driveway, so I didn't, I never went in. I just wanted to see if he was home. And I drove all the way out there, and the truck wasn't there. So I was like, well, he's not home. It was raining when I went out that afternoon. Well, now we're not going because it's raining, so I'm just going to go out and see why he's not answering my call, because I still had a few hours before my daughter would get home. And then I drove out, and the truck wasn't there, so I just turned around in the church and went back.
She says that they only had plans to go horseback riding in the afternoon after church. Remember, Anita and Jim went to different churches. Anita at a church in Louisville, and Jim across the street from his house. This was our first talk with Anita. But when we started talking to Jim's family, everyone we talked to said that, actually, Jim's girlfriend was supposed to go to church with Jim that Sunday morning, but never showed up. And even left several voicemails on Jim's phone, saying that she felt sick and couldn't come to church with him. So did she have plans to go to Jim's church with him on Sunday morning? Or was it just solely plans to go horseback riding later that afternoon? It may seem pointless to get carried away in the semantics of it all, but remember, Jim is dead in his bathroom on Sunday. Every little detail matters. So we called Anita another time to clear up the discrepancies. We asked her, was it possible that they had plans that Sunday to go to church together at Jim's church?
Not that I remember. See, I always went on Saturday nights. I didn't go on Sunday. And especially on the weekends, my daughter was gone. I always went on Saturday nights to Southeast. So I didn't go on Sunday. He had invited me to church with him that Sunday, but I wasn't comfortable about going. And so he just said, well, we'll go after I go to church. We were just supposed to meet up after he went to church because he was going to go early to church. I was in beginning stages of cancer even then. Some days I would wake up so sick, and so that's why I usually went to church on Saturday night, because mornings were really hard for me. And I was supposed to went with him, and I told him, I said, well, I'm not really comfortable with it because I don't know how I'm going to feel in the morning. But later in the day, I'll probably get to feeling better. So, we'll meet up, we'll have lunch, and we'll go riding. And that's how it turned out. Like, when I got up, I do believe I did leave him a message, because I called him all day long. Like, I got freaked out, because thinking maybe he was mad because, I backed out of church. And so I left message after message after message. And then that's when I called Catherine and said, hey, I've even wrote out the house. His truck isn't there. And she goes, did you go inside? And I was like, no, I would never go inside without him being home. I said, but I just drove, and then I turned around and came back home. I said, but that's just not like him, because he's not returned any of my calls. And I think she did ask me, you didn't go to church with him? I'm like, no, I think I told her I didn't feel good. I was sick when I got up that morning. I think that's when that Sunday night's when I told her that. And she goes, oh, because I thought you were going to church with him. And I'm like, yeah, I was, But I just wasn't comfortable. When we hung up last night, I told him we'd see in the morning, and I didn't feel like it when I got up.
So it seems like what actually happened was this. Jim and Anita talked on Saturday night. Jim invites her to come to his church in the morning. Anita says that she isn't sure how she'll feel in the morning, so she says something to the effect of, "We'll see in the morning." The next morning comes and Anita doesn't feel good, so decides not to go, and leaves a voicemail for Jim. Later that afternoon, when Jim doesn't call or answer any of her phone calls, Anita gets worried that maybe he's mad at her and decides to drive over to check on him. That's a total of 3 different groups of people that check on Jim on Sunday. Kathy, her son and Toot, Anita, and then Catherine and Tony.
We mentioned in an earlier episode that many people believe that there was more than one suspect involved in Jim's murder. Everyone we talked to told us that they thought it had to be more than one person. So why do people think that? Reason number 1 is that Jim was not a small man. He was almost 6 feet tall and had military background as a member of the military police. So people struggled to believe that one person could have overtaken Jim by themselves. Sure, one person could have surprised Jim or used a weapon to subdue him, but it seems more probable that 2 people did this. Especially if you factor in how the suspect or suspects would have gotten to Jim's house.
Which leads us to number 2. Last year, we took a drive from downtown Shelbyville to Jim's house on Rockbridge Road. We did this because we wanted to see how the suspect or suspects would have gotten to Jim's house. It's about a 10-minute drive once you get off of Interstate 64. Remember, after murdering Jim, the suspect or suspects left Rockbridge Road in Jim's truck. So how did they get to Jim's house? Let's just say for a moment, for argument's sake, that it was just one person. This person would have had to either walk to Jim's house or someone had to drop them off. Here's some audio from our trip.
So at the end of the day, one of the things we're doing here is to see if this was walkable, right? Because the argument that some people made is that whoever committed this crime could have been on foot.
Right.
And then gone to a bank. Even though we know that we have video evidence showing someone in a vehicle, the question then becomes... How do they get
to the house, though? That's the question. This would be a weird spot to walk.
It's an impossible spot to walk.
Yeah.
You're going to get hit by a car. Yeah. There's drop-offs.
You definitely have to drive to his house, for sure. Or have somebody drop you off. One of the two. I would say it's pretty safe to say nobody is walking this road at night. Like,
I wouldn't walk it during the day.
Oh.
A lot of blind curves.
Yeah.
A lot of hills. A lot of drop-offs.
Probably very dark when they walk.
Passing a lot of creeks. The only way that I would give any credence to the idea of somebody walking is if they had a stashed vehicle, maybe up the road. So maybe they could have walked to a vehicle, but even then it would have to be very close by. You're going to turn right onto Rockbridge Road here in about 0.7 of a mile. And as soon as you turn, it looks like the church is right there.
Bridge United Methodist Church.
So there's the church.
So yeah, it's like very close.
Yeah. Oh, there's nothing around this place.
No.
There's a small trailer.
Nothing back here at all.
Trailer home, but it is.
That looks kind of... That's a new house, so it definitely wasn't here.
That one.
The closest house is right here. How far away are we from the...
Another 1/4 mile.
Yeah.
If you want, turn around to this driveway way right here. It is a very secluded spot.
It's a lot closer to the church than I thought it was going to be.
Like, you could throw a football and get the church.
Oh, yeah. You could throw a wiffle ball into the church.
Yeah.
Basically.
But then, to the right or to the left, there's nothing.
Yeah. It feels all but impossible that anyone would have walked to Jim's house alone in the dark down those windy roads. On the way to Jim's house, just a few streets before Rockbridge Road, It's literally impossible to walk on the side of the road, as there is no side of the road. If one person killed Jim alone, they had to be dropped off. There's no way around that. Based on what we know to this point, it's more feasible and probable that this is the scenario that likely took place. Two suspects arrive in the vicinity of Jim's house, maybe even parking their vehicle right across the street at the church or down the street just out of sight. They walk a short distance to Jim's house. Catherine mentioned in episode 2 that she noticed a window screen looked like it had been pried open a little. It's even possible that this was the spot the suspects first tried to get in, but the window was locked, so they decide to go in through Bo's dog door. Once they murdered Jim, they had to split up. They didn't want to be seen on ATM footage in their own vehicle, so one person got in Jim's truck and headed to Jim's bank, and the other drove the vehicle they parked to downtown Shelbyville to wait for the person in Jim's truck. We know Jim's truck was eventually dumped around Jim's bank in Shelbyville. This seems to be the most consistent scenario of what actually took place, which would point to at least two suspects, and not one. We talked last episode about how the robbery at Jim's house on Halloween night seemed personal. Something we haven't mentioned yet about Jim's murder is that the suspects who killed Jim took a trophy of sorts from Jim's house. This detail only piles on more to the theory that Jim was killed by someone he knew, and not a stranger or a serial killer.
I know that 2 days before Jim's death, was telling a friend of his he was on a tangent telling how much he hated my brother and that he was not going to pay him that restitution, that he did not owe him that restitution, that my brother gave him that money and he had no intentions of ever paying him that money back, and how much he hated my brother.
There's also this detail about Bo that always seems strange. Why wasn't Bo also murdered that night? You would imagine that if a serial killer killed Jim, they would have likely killed Bo too, at the very least to keep him quiet.
Bo being left alive points towards the theory that Jim was killed by someone he knew, maybe even someone Bo knew, or was at least familiar with.
It was in the summer, and was with him, and he said he had gotten Bo, he had adopted him from the Shelby County Animal Shelter.
The person Catherine says was with Jim when he adopted Bo was the family member of the acquaintance from last episode.
So I went through paperwork last night, and it states on here that he adopted Bo on the 3rd of July of 2008. Now, this person was with him. And it actually says on the back of it, I'm sorry. Yeah, this one's now, Josiah, this is catching me off guard. It has Jim's handwriting, which does this every time. Yeah, I actually save scraps of his paper where he'll write a grocery list. I know it may sound silly to other people, but I will save his grocery list because it has, I just had it together 2 minutes ago. That has Jim's handwriting on it. But it says Monday, 9 a.m., so I'm going to assume that's when they open. It has $33 and $25, so I'm going to assume that's the adoption fees that he had on the back of it. So it has his, Jim's address, and it's the placement agreement when he adopted Bo. So the other person was with him when he adopted him, because this person, worked with Jim, and he stayed at his house quite a bit. But what the police had also told me was that the people that did this, if they did not kill him, they were pretty certain that they knew who he was. It would have been personal for them not to kill him. And the next day, I'm pretty sure it was the next day, the whole family was over at my house. Just walked into through my garage door. My husband was upstairs. My father-in-law, who was bigger than my husband, literally lunged at him. And I stood in between them because I was trying to stay calm. I figured that was the best way to try to get any answers at all. And I told them, I said, go tell Tony that he was there. And we went out in the garage. I was sitting on the steps, the garage steps, and he was in the garage, and he was just pretty much just rambling, talking. I could hear my husband running down the stairs, and that's in the middle of the house. I could hear him running down the stairs, and when he came out the door, he lunged for him too. And I told him, we're just talking, and I think it kind of shocked him that I was that calm. But while we were in there talking and I'm trying to ask questions, Bo came into the garage. He had been in the yard. I think I had said previously, when Jim did the underground electric fencing, he literally did the same fencing we had. So in case our dogs came over, they had the same fencing and we didn't have to worry about it so they could play together. Again, that's who my brother was. So Bo comes through the garage door, and as soon as he saw him, said his name, trying to get Bo to come to him, and Bo tucked tail. He was afraid of him. And he got out of that garage as fast as he could. He was afraid of him and would not come near him.
There's also this interesting story we heard from several different people about an argument Jim had with someone.
And even the week before he died, he had helped a couple, and I don't know the couple's name, I never did, but he had told me he'd, helped them quite a bit money-wise, financially, and they were mad because for the first time he had told them no, that he couldn't do it anymore. He just couldn't help them anymore, and they were mad at him. He even had mentioned that he thought that guy was the one that had robbed him. I don't know if he, knew the guy better than the girl, or the girl was just with him. I don't know. And he had told me, he said, yeah, one of the guys I know, I've known him for years because I've helped him so many times. And then he has the gall to come by here and think I'm going to give him a few $100s. He said, and I just wasn't going to do it. He said, he's never cleaned up his act. He's not cleaning it up now. And he said, now I've got mine cleaned up and I'm not going back. So when he said that, I assumed the guy drank, because I knew Jim drank. But I never knew. He never mentioned drugs. He just said, he's not cleaned up and he's probably never going to be cleaned up.
The identity of these two individuals is still a mystery to this day.
This argument happened during the last week of Jim's life. Jim was robbed on Halloween night. Then a few days later, a couple shows up to his house and they start arguing about money. Then a few more days later, Jim is murdered. And the killer also takes money from Jim's account. This is all either extremely coincidental or it's connected somehow. Could the same person have done all three? If you do enough research online about Jim's case, you'll come across another unsolved murder out of Colorado that a lot of people have pointed out some striking similarities with. In May of 2004, the body of Al Kite was discovered in the basement of his residence in Aurora, Colorado. Al had been bound, beaten, tortured, and stabbed.
The suspect of this murder stole the victim's truck and cell phone and used his debit card at an ATM. There is even ATM footage of the suspect in a ski mask as he drove Al's truck. What's even more striking is that Al was likely killed on a Sunday, just like Jim. And his sister was the one who was notified when he didn't show up to work. Though in Al's case, his sister lived across the country, so she called the police to do a wellness check. While these two murders seem eerily similar at first glance, the similarities start to fade away as you begin to dive deeper into the Al Kite case.
First, there's a good lead on who killed Al, and it points to a single suspect who did not know Al personally.
A week before his murder, Al put an ad in the paper saying he was looking to rent out his basement to a tenant, as a previous tenant was moving out. The suspect in Al's murder met with Al, and even other people in the area who had also had ads out for rental properties.
The suspect seemed like he had done this before. He even went as far as soaking knives, Al's keys, and other household items with bleach to erase any potential DNA evidence. He also used a burner phone to communicate with Al about the rental property before the murder. And after murdering Al, the suspect purposefully left the burner phone and Al's phone in a place downtown that the homeless often hung around. Presumably, the suspect knew that the phones would be picked up and used by unknown transients. All of this points to Al being murdered by someone random, likely by a serial killer. Al's murder did not seem personal. So while there are some striking similarities between the two, it's safe to assume that Jim and Al were not murdered by the same person. It seems pretty clear by taking a step back and looking at all the pieces of Jim's murder that Jim was killed by at least 2 people that night. And these people weren't strangers. So with all of this information in hand, the cast of characters is known. The timelines are clear.
What do the police have to say about their investigation?
And who they have talked to.
Who have they ruled out? Are there airtight alibis to cross off the list?
Well, that's the problem. We don't know. Repeat attempts to contact and talk with detectives has ended up futile, being ghosted at every turn. Even Catherine has no updates on the case because she can't get in contact with them. Remember, Jim's murder isn't a recent one. It's been 14 years. This case is cold. The case has even been handed off to its 7th investigator in 14 years, just a few weeks ago. The saddest part? No one from Post 12 has notified the family of the changes, or given any updates on the investigation in a long time. This is an active investigation. Some names have been changed, but the details remain the same. This podcast will withhold certain information critical to the case, so as not to impact the integrity of the investigation being carried out by the Kentucky State Police and other law enforcement agencies.
If you or someone you know have information related to Jim Duckett's murder, please call Kentucky State Police Post 12 at 502-227-2221. Or you can text a tip to 67283 by typing in KSPTIP in the message field. Leave a space and then enter the information that you have regarding the crime. The messages are then sent to a separate service where any identifying information is removed to keep it anonymous. Follow us on social media to keep up to date with information from the podcast and any other details that could come out related to this case.